I change, you change, we all change, don't we? But what explains that, right? What's the ultimate explanation of change? Well, philosopher Edward Feser argues in his Aristotelian Proof that the only adequate answer to these questions is ultimately in terms of an unchangeable, purely actual being. In short, the classical theistic God. Now, the Aristotelian Proof traces its intellectual heritage back to the time of Aristotle, and it's also received pretty influential treatment over the centuries by thinkers like Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas. In this video, however, I'm going to be presenting a number of undercutting and rebutting defeaters to the argument, and some of its premises and inferential steps. This video is going to be based on a paper that is forthcoming in the journal Sophia, entitled Stage 1 of the Aristotelian Proof, a Critical Appraisal. I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and let's dig in. Now, you guys know that I love my outlines, and so first I want to note that I'm only going to be focusing on Stage 1 in this video. I'll perhaps dedicate a future video to Stage 2. So the outline for my video is, first I'm going to cover the argument itself, I'm going to explain it and its key concepts, then we're going to be looking at the dialectical context and the nature of the defeaters that can be leveled towards it, and then we're going to take a look at premise 7 and per se chains, as well as the causal principle and existence as stasis, attention, purely actual, changeable necessary beings, responses, and conclusion. Very exciting stuff indeed. So, Feser's Aristotelian proof is divided into two stages. Stage 1 seeks to demonstrate the existence of a purely actual, unactualized actualizer of the existence of act-potency composite beings, while Stage 2 identifies such a being, or at least attempts to do so, with the god of classical theism. In keeping with the classical theistic tradition, of course, Feser characterizes God as purely actual, that is to say unchangeable, absolutely simple, that is to say not admitting of metaphysical or physical parts, he's non-composite, everything that is intrinsic to him is identical to him, and finally a being who creates and sustains in a single act every non-God positive ontological item. Another key concept here is going to be change, and the analysis of change that undergirds the argument, namely change as the actualization of potential. So roughly, and most generally, change is at least going to involve some kind of successive difference or non-identity in the features of things. It involves something in reality, or perhaps reality itself, going from one thing to another. And there are many different kinds of change, right? There's intrinsic and extrinsic change, there's accidental and substantial change, and so on. Something undergoes accidental change when it gains or loses something, but nevertheless persists in existence through such a gain or loss. So, for instance, when you get a haircut, you don't thereby cease to exist. Unless, of course, your hairdresser is particularly violent, but we can set that aside. You remain or continue in existence despite the fact that the length of your hair changed, right? The haircut did not kill you, or even replace you with a distinct but highly similar person with shorter hair. By contrast, substantial change refers to the coming into or going out of existence of something. When little Fido dies, for instance, Fido ceases to exist altogether and gives way to a corpse. Fido himself does not survive or persist through this change. Now, to be sure, cases of coming into being, there isn't a substance that undergoes the change, but rather it's the very production or coming to be of the substance in the first place. And so you might think that change is, the word change is misleading here, but we can set that aside. What really matters is that we have kind of a clear understanding of these two types of change on the table. And so now we can ask, what is change? What does change consist in? Well, one influential answer to this question was Aristotle's, right? Change is the actualization of a potential. It is the reduction of potency to act, the transition from potential to actual. So potential being, or potency, or potentiality, refers to determinable, incomplete, indefinite, and unfulfilled existence. It is that which can be, but is actually not. You can kind of think of it as something analogous to unrealized possibility. It's a rough analogy, but, it'll do. Now, by contrast, actual being, or act, or actuality, refers to determinate, complete, occurrent, definite, and fulfilled existence. It is the realization of that which can be, or the fulfillment of that which is capable of being. According to James Dolezal, potency in a thing accounts for its ability to exist, become, and change, while act is that by which the existence or change is brought about. Potency is the ability or capacity for a thing to become either substantially or accidentally different than it is. An entity is in potency to whatever perfections it can acquire, but presently does not possess in actuality. End quote. Thus, when a banana ripens, its previously unrealized or unactualized potential for turning yellow becomes actual. Okay, so to be sure, there are other accounts of the metaphysics of change, but those aren't going to concern us here, because we're just going to kind of grant Feser this analysis of change as the actualization of potential. Lots of philosophers have their doubts about that. It's arguably going to require an analogical conception of being, for instance, because there's actual being and there's potential being, and a lot of philosophers aren't going to be happy with that. They're going to want to say that no, being is univocal. But we can set those kind of worries aside, and we can just grant Feser that change is the actualization of a potential, and we have potential being and actual being. So, with those preliminaries out of the way, we can now look at the argument. So, this is from his book, of course, 5 Proofs. This is from pages 35 to 36. So premise 1, change, which, according to premise 2, is the actualization of potential, is a real feature of the world. I omitted that for the sake of space. So that seems relatively obvious, right? I mean, you're going from listening to me to listening to me say something else. I'm going from saying something to not saying something, and so on. And so premise 2 is, of course, change is the actualization of potential, in which case the actualization of potential is a real feature of the world. Now, no potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. This is the causal principle. It's essentially saying that whenever something reduces from potency to act, that is to say, whenever a potential is actualized, it becomes actual, it's made actual, well then that's going to be actualized, causally actualized by something already actual. This is tantamount to the claim that whatever changes is changed by another, is caused to undergo that change by another. But this is a more precise, formulation of that. So no potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it, and so any change is caused by something already actual. Now, the occurrence of any change C presupposes some thing or substance S which changes. So, for instance, as I'm speaking right now, right, well, these changes that occur, those can only happen if, I have my vocal cords and I exist and I'm able here to, exercise my causal powers in various ways and so on. So the occurrence of changes around us presuppose the things that undergo those changes. It's a kind of substance-first ontology, which is, very Aristotelian. But the existence of S, so this is a thing or substance which changes, the existence of S at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of S's potential for existence. So this is saying that things which undergo change, their very being or existence is such that its potential is concurrently actualized at any given moment at which it exists. So this is just saying that substances which undergo change, their very being requires a sustaining cause, according to Feser, at any given moment at which it exists. This is an efficient sustaining cause, and this cause consists in the actualization of S's potential for existence. It's causing S to become actual, to transition from potency to act. That's why it's an actualization of S's potential. And so any substance S has, at any moment at which it exists, some actualizer A of its existence. That follows when you apply the causal principle to what we just said here. Now, A's own existence at the moment it actualizes S presupposes either A, the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, or A's being purely actual. Now, if A's own existence at the moment it actualizes S presupposes the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, well then there exists a regress of concurrent, sustaining, efficient actualizers that is either infinite or terminates in a purely actual actualizer. But there cannot be infinite chains, which are concurrent, sustaining, actualizing chains, because they're hierarchical or per se, and such theories cannot regress infinitely. And so, I guess I should say something about that. So the idea is essentially like, in such chains, the relevant causal power or relevant causal feature exists in the non-fundamental or secondary members of the chain in a kind of wholly derivative manner. They merely transmit a kind of causal power that is bestowed upon them. They don't have the causal power or property of the series of themselves, but instead they merely transmit it and wholly derive it from another. They are, as it were, instruments. So, for instance, when I use a paintbrush, right, the paintbrush doesn't have any power of itself to move in the various ways that it does when I'm painting a painting, right? But it can, function as that cause insofar as I bestow it that causal power. And so in this case, I'm a kind of primary cause in this series, whereas the non-fundamental member would be like the handle. It doesn't have the relevant causal power of itself, but it only transmits that causal power that is bestowed to it by me. And so the idea here with the infinite regress of this kind of hierarchical or per se chain, the idea of ruling that out is like, well, suppose that we didn't have that kind of primary or fundamental member with that built-in or non-derived actuality of the series in question. Well, then we would just have infinitely many members, all of which are just deriving it from the other members. But that's like an infinite chain of instruments, right? That's like an infinite chain of things that derive the relevant causal power or causal property from without. But in that case, it seems as though we don't really even have an ultimate explanation of the particular property or power in question. Because the members, all the members of themselves don't have the power or property. And so they wholly derive it from without. But if the chain is infinite, then there's nowhere from which, there's no primary member from which they're deriving it. And so we just have this infinite derivative chain. And it seems as though that's not really going to deliver us the relevant causal feature or property or what have you. The way I like to think of it is something like a chain of IOUs. Suppose that you owe me $10, and I'm like, okay, listen, pay up. I want my money, okay? I need to go buy, like a protein bar or something so that I can fuel my workout. And then you say, well, you don't lift. I mean, okay, that's not what you say. By the way, I bike, I don't lift. I mean, okay. Okay, so that's not what you say. What you say is, well, okay, Joe, I'll give you the money, but it's an IOU. So, I have this IOU, and I have to go retrieve it from another person, okay? So I'm going to go and retrieve that from someone else. We'll call them Sandy, okay? So this person goes over to Sandy, and is like, hey, I need to pay Joe $10. And Sandy's like, okay, but I'm going to give you an IOU, and because I only wholly derive this money from Tyler, I don't know. And then they go to Tyler, and then the same thing is true of Tyler. And it's just this infinite chain of IOUs. It's like, if that's the case, and it doesn't bottom out in something that actually possesses that money of itself, well, then it seems as though I'm never, after all, going to get my $10, right? It's like an ungrounded chain in the sense that we don't actually have an explanation of why I have the relevant causal feature or property. And in that case, I'm just not going to have it, because the only way I could have it is if I could derive it from without. But if we have this infinite chain, well, then it's all of them are also deriving it from without, such that we're all just derivatively having this thing, but we don't have anywhere from which to derive it. So that's essentially the reasoning here behind that, the denial of an infinite regress of a hierarchical or per se causal series. For a more in-depth characterization of per se causal series, you can check out my video on the first way. Okay, so hopefully we're staying with it. So 12, so either A itself is a purely actual actualizer, or there is a purely actual actualizer which terminates a regress that begins with the actualization of A, and so the occurrence of C, that change, and thus the existence of S at any given moment presupposes the existence of a purely actual actualizer, and since there are such changes and there are such substances, it follows that there is a purely actual actualizer. So I guess if we were to state it informally, the idea would be the following. Nothing can be reduced or transitioned from potency to act except by some causal actualizer in a state of actuality. But any substance that is a composite of act and potency is, at any moment at which it exists, reducing from potentially existent to actually existent, and hence it requires a concurrent sustaining actualizer of its existence, given that such potentials, when they're actualized, when they reduce from potency to act, require something already actual to actualize them. This hierarchical or per se chain of sustaining actualizers cannot be infinite, in which case it must terminate in a purely actual unactualized actualizer. Because again, if it terminated in something which is a composite of act and potency, well, then it would require some further actualizer, because that premise that anything which is a composite of potency and act requires some kind of concurrent, sustaining, efficient actualizer of its very existence. In much, much shorter terms, in simpler terms, the ultimate explanation of change, including the very being or existence of substances that change, must be in terms of a purely actual being. And then it's argued in stage 2 that this purely actual actualizer is the god of classical theism. So how am I going to proceed forward in this video? Well, here's the structure. I'm going to begin by discussing the dialectical context of the Aristotelian proof, as well as the different kinds of criticisms that one can legitimately offer against any argument. And then I'm going to consider a number of defeaters that by my lights afflict premise 7 of Feser's argument, which is this one right here. And then I'm going to articulate an account of per se chains, and I'm going to argue that it provides an undercutting defeater for Feser's argument. And then finally, I'm going to argue that Feser's inference, or at least implicit inference, from presently unactualized actualizer to purely actual actualizer is a non sequitur on multiple fronts. I'm going to emphasize that my criticisms of stage 1 of the Aristotelian proof leveled in this video are not going to exhaust my criticisms thereof, right? There's going to be actually a whole dialectical avenue of criticism that I'm not going to pursue in this video, and instead that I've pursued on my blog and my IJPR paper and various videos of mine, namely existential inertia. But it'll be interesting to see, though, that the case against the Aristotelian proof doesn't actually rest on the truth or rational defensibility of existential inertia, as we shall see. So if you're looking for a video that's going to be going in depth on existential inertia, this is not going to be it, because this is a video that I'm going to set aside existential inertia for the most part, and I'm going to argue that the argument fails irrespective of existential inertia. But I'm also going to point you guys to the resources and stuff that I've done on existential inertia, because it's yet another dialectical avenue by which one could target the Aristotelian proof. All right, the dialectical context. So before turning to my appraisal of Feser's Aristotelian proof simpliciter, we need to get clear on the dialectical context thereof. So a dialectical context is the conversational environment or circumstances surrounding an argument, claim, or issue. Now, importantly, it functions to set the burden or burdens of proof for the various parties engaged in the conversation. And so we need to ask, what's the present dialectical context, the one in my video? Well, we're in a context wherein Feser is aiming to give a positive demonstration of God's existence. And as such, the burden is on Feser to provide those who don't already accept his premises with reasons or justification for accepting them. Moreover, if the success of Feser's argument requires ruling out some thesis P, but Feser does not succeed in ruling out thesis P, say because it's assumed without providing adequate justification, or its justification rests on the truth of the very thing needing to be established, or it conflicts with other portions of the argument, then the argument itself wouldn't be successful. Or at least it wouldn't succeed when it comes to those who accept or are agnostic about the truth of that thesis P. Similarly, if the success of Feser's argument, or the truth or proposed justification of one of its premises, assumes the truth of some thesis P, but Feser doesn't provide adequate justification for P, well then the argument itself will be resting on an inadequately justified assumption. And in that case, for philosophers who don't already accept P, the argument will rightly be viewed as unsuccessful. Argumentation, of course, is dialectical, and so in order to succeed, Feser's argument should provide those who don't already accept its premises with some reason or justification to accept them, right? Justification that doesn't rest on further assumptions or presuppositions which are left inadequately justified, but which Feser's dialectical opponents don't accept. These dialectical points bridge nicely into two kinds of criticism that one may legitimately level towards an argument. These aren't exhaustive. I've gone through different kinds of criticism in other videos of mine, like Morean criticisms and so on. But for here, we're just going to consider undercutting and rebutting. So as I use the phrase here, I know it's used differently in like epistemology, but as I use it here, it just in terms of argument analysis, an undercutting defeater doesn't attempt to show that a premise or assumption is false. Instead, it merely shows it to lack proper warrant or justification. Now, note that the relevant sense of warrant or justification here attaches to the one who doesn't already accept the argument or premise or assumption in question. Now, to be sure, the proponent of the argument, like Feser, may be perfectly justified or warranted in accepting the argument, premise, or assumption. I mean, after all, someone could reason, premise 1, if God exists, then God exists. Premise 2, God exists. Therefore, conclusion, God exists. Now, someone who reasons this way might very well be justified or warranted in accepting the premises of the argument, and hence its conclusion. But the question is whether the argument, or more accurately, its premises and what is said on their behalf, gives those who don't already accept the argument, that is, who don't accept one or more of its premises or assumptions, sufficient reason or justification to change their mind and accept it. Right? The purpose of an undercutting defeater, then, is to show that nothing within an argument, including what is said on behalf of its premises, gives those who don't already accept one or more of its premises or assumptions sufficient reason to change their minds. Now that contrasts with a rebutting defeater, which aims to show the actual or probable falsity of a premise or assumption. So my appraisal of the Aristotelian proof won't solely be employing rebutting defeaters. There will be a number of occasions, of course, where I uncover an underlying assumption of a premise or the justification leveled on its behalf, and, instead of showing it to be false, argue that it is simply inadequately justified in the dialectical context at hand, and that's a perfectly legitimate way to criticize an argument. And then there's one final thing to note concerning the dialectical context here, and it is the Aristotelian proof's independence from a variety of other large-scale theoretical commitments. So in particular, Feser aims for his Aristotelian proof to be independent of his Thomistic proof, in which he relies on the Thomistic conception of esse, that is to say the act of existence, the real distinction between essence and esse, and so on. He also aims for it to be independent of other large-scale theoretical commitments like presentism or eternalism, which he says on page 50 of his book, and Aristotelian hylomorphism. So he writes, for instance, that, quote, Aristotelian hylomorphism is controversial, and I refrain from putting things in terms of it because doing so is not necessary to it, end quote, but what he's referring to when he says it is the Aristotelian proof. That's on pages 28 to 29 of his book. So while considerations of the real distinction, the Thomistic conception of esse, Aristotelian hylomorphism, and other large-scale theoretical commitments might supplement the argument, Feser expressly intends his proof to stand irrespective of them. So, with these dialectical points covered, let's begin my appraisal by considering premise 7 of the argument. You might think, like, Joe, why do you have to get into all these points? But you would be surprised how much confusion that misunderstanding the dialectical context can engender. But yeah, let's get into premise 7. So, we're going to be examining the justification for premise 7 of Feser's argument. So, recall that this premise states that the existence of S at any given moment, so this is a substance that changes, right? The existence of S at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of S's potential for existence. So I'm going to argue that this premise is not adequately justified. And to see this, we're going to have to examine Feser's proffered justification for it. Now, Feser writes, what keeps the water in existence at any particular moment? After all, given the chemistry of the water, the matter that makes it up also has the potential to exist instead as distinct quantities of oxygen and hydrogen. But that is not the potential that is being actualized right now. Instead, it is the matter's potential to exist as water that is being actualized right now. Why? It's no good to answer that such and such a process occurred at some time in the past so as to combine the hydrogen and oxygen in just the right way. That tells us how the water got here, but that is not what we are asking about. What we're asking about, again, is what keeps the water in existence at any instant at which it does, in fact, exist. Okay, so there is a lot to unpack here. So first, notice that Feser claims that it's the matter's potential to exist as water that is presently being actualized. But being actualized is arguably a notion of causal actualization. And so I suggest looking for a more neutral description of the situation, one that doesn't include the very thing to be demonstrated in its specification, right? I mean, recall that Feser is aiming to demonstrate that the matter is presently reducing from potentially existent as water to actually existent as water, and so we cannot justifiably describe the situation from the get-go as one involving the matter's being actualized as water, if we're understanding being actualized as a notion of causal actualization. That's often how it seems like it's being used in Feser's chapter. And so instead of claiming that matter's potential is presently being actualized, what we need is a more neutral description. And that neutral description would just say that the matter's potential to exist as water is presently actual, instead of is being actualized. Now, of course, one might point out at this juncture that by framing the discussion in terms of act and potency, we've already granted that the context is a causal one, in which case my point concerning the distinction between is presently actual and is being actualized is wrong-headed. Now, in response, note first that while the Aristotelian notion of causality is indeed largely or principally cast in terms of act and potency, this only shows that if there's a relation of causation obtaining here, then it will, for the Aristotelian, be analyzed in terms of act and potency, and more specifically the actualization of some potency. But first, the antecedent of this conditional is precisely what Feser is aiming to demonstrate in the first place here, right? The very question at issue is whether the water's present actuality consists in a reduction or transition or becoming of potency to act, and hence the very question at issue is whether or not this is a causal context to begin with. The antecedent of that conditional, in other words, is something that Feser's thus far proffered justification does not warrant. And second, and more importantly, this conditional does not mean, entail, or justify the following conditional. If the situation is one in which the water is actual, then the water's actuality consists in a reduction of potency to act. And so the heart of the distinction here, really, is that not all actualities consist in or involve or result from reductions of potency to act. And note, of course, that we're talking about efficient causal actualization of the potential for existence of the whole substance here, since that's precisely the kind of reduction of potency to act that concerns Feser and his Aristotelian proof. There are things that are, one, actual, but two, whose actuality is not an actualized one. That is, not one consisting in the concurrent reduction of potency to act by some causal actualizer. For Feser, one example of this would be God, of course, right? God is actual, but his actuality does not consist in a reduction from potency to act. It's an unactualized actuality. And for those who don't already accept Feser's premise, that is, those who don't already accept that substances, changeable substances, are concurrently reducing from potency to act in respect of their actual or substantial existence, one example of an actuality that is an unactualized actuality may very well be the present existence of the water. The point for now is that Feser has, in the passage thus cited, given those in this latter camp no reason to abandon their view, since he has simply described from the get-go that the water's actuality is an actualized actuality, instead of merely one that is presently actual but not actualized. And so the challenge I've leveled to Feser here is best understood as follows. Feser and the argument's detractors both agree that some actualities are actualized actualities, that is, ones consisting in the reduction of potency to act, while other actualities are unactualized actualities. Because Feser is attempting to justify premise 7, the onus is on him to give detractors of the premise some reason to think that the water's existence is an actualized actuality as opposed to an unactualized actuality. But by describing the situation from the get-go as one involving the water's being actualized, he has not succeeded in fulfilling this onus, and has instead simply built in the falsity of the detractor's view into the very description of the situation at hand. And notice, moreover, that once we alter the phrasing to the more neutral, the matter's potential to exist as water is presently actual right now, we cannot straightforwardly infer the need for a concurrent sustaining efficient cause of the water's existence, right? Remember Feser's causal principle, or CP, captured in premises 4 and 5. Crucially, CP only demands an efficient causal actualizer when there is a transition from potentiality to actuality. It does not claim that whatever is presently actual requires efficient causal actualization. The non-question-begging description of the water situation, however, only allows us to conclude that the matter's potential is presently actual. And as to why this present actuality consists in a reduction of, or transition from, potency to act, no justification has been proffered. Now, merely alleging at this juncture that detractors of the Aristotelian proof haven't addressed the question, what concurrently keeps the water in existence at any given moment, will not do by way of response. So now we're considering this first response to my criticism here. This won't do by way of a response, right? Just asking, well, hey, the detractors haven't answered what concurrently keeps the water in existence. For consider again the causal principle, or CP. According to CP, a concurrent causal keeper or sustainer of the water's existence is only demanded if the water is, after all, presently transitioning from potency to act in respect of its existence. And of course, that is precisely the question at hand. The very point of contention in this dialectical context is whether the water is, after all, presently transitioning from potentially existent to actually existent. Here's a second response one might give. One may argue that per the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, the present existence of the water, or any substance for that matter, requires explanation, and absent a concurrently operative existential sustaining cause, efficient cause that is, there is no explanation for the present existence of the water. We can call this the PSR response. So the PSR response, however, won't work, by my lights at least. For, plausibly, past things can and do legitimately explain the existence of present things. And what's more, later we'll see that plausibly we don't even need to appeal to past states to explain present ones. I'm going to provide later what I take to be at least a plausible metaphysical account of per se chains, or at least one necessary condition for them, on which the absence of a tendency to expire or annihilate, combined with a few other conditions, explains the present existence of the substance. This is something that, for instance, John Baudouin has pointed out in the context of existential inertia, but mine is going to be focusing more so on the metaphysics of per se chains, rather than existential inertia. But back to the PSR response. So, again, plausibly past things can and do legitimately explain the existence of present things. Indeed, it seems difficult to square our ordinary common-sense explanatory practices, and for that matter our scientific practices, with a position on which past things entirely lack explanatory force. Now, delving into arguments in favor of that would take us too far afield given my present purposes, and I can just make two notes right now. So first, a dialectical point. So Feser himself seems to agree that past things can causally explain, or just otherwise explain, maybe not even causally, but at least explain present things. So for instance, Feser writes that something, quote, did exist simpliciter at one time is enough for it to bear a causal relation to me, end quote. He says that in a blog post of his from 2019. And it also seems deeply plausible upon reflection. So, for instance, plausibly the immediately temporally prior state and state or action or obtaining of something can explain the immediately temporally posterior obtaining or state of something else. So again, that was just a dialectical point, but here's a second and more important point, and that's one concerning defeaters. Even if one holds that past things cannot legitimately explain present things, what matters for present purposes is that neither Feser nor the hypothetical proponent of the PSR response have, in the dialectical context at hand, neither of them have given those who think that the present existence of an act potency composite object could be explained by some past thing any reason to abandon their view. What could such a past thing be? Well, it could be, say, the immediately temporally prior state and existence of the object in question, or something else. Other explanations are available to the detractor of the Aristotelian proof, too, here. So, for instance, when I say CF next slide, we actually don't even need to cite past things. We can actually, if you look at my, this will be in the description. If you look at my response to Shaw and Sanders, I provide maybe 5 or 6 different metaphysical accounts of existential inertia. That is to say, trying to pinpoint that in virtue of which metaphysically existential inertia obtains, and in which the momentary, moment-by-moment existence of temporal substances is explained. And so there's nothing brute in such a case, and nevertheless they persist inertially. And so you can check out this blog post in response to them. It'll be linked in the description. All these will be linked in the description. These are all on existential inertia. Some of the stuff that I've made public on existential inertia. A lot of it is contained in another project that I'll talk about later on in this video. But I just wanted to, again, we're not going to pursue existential inertia any farther than what I just did, just gesturing towards these sorts of things. I just wanted to point out that this PSR response faces a lot of difficulties, and one of them is that, well, past things can legitimately explain present things, but also we don't even need to adduce past things. So even if this point were to fail, we still have yet another point in response to the PSR response. So, as a third response, Feser might argue that we have clear experiential cases wherein more fundamental realities efficiently causally sustain less fundamental realities, and hence we have grounds for holding that substances like water are presently reducing from potentially existent to actually existent. In other words, he might argue that we know that, say, water is presently reducing from potentially existent to actually existent, because we can clearly see that it has sustaining efficient causes in terms of more fundamental realities, like, for instance, the chemical bonds and the oxygen and the atoms and the electrons and whatnot. Indeed, Feser himself makes this point when he writes on pages 26 to 27, quote, "The potential of the coffee to exist here and now is actualized in part by the existence of the water, which in turn exists only because a certain potential of the atoms is being actualized, where these atoms themselves exist only because a certain potential of the subatomic particles is being actualized," end quote. Now, one response to this is that this is inapplicable to foundational things, that is to say, things that aren't further composed of more fundamental items. So, for instance, even if this would apply successfully to water, that's not to say that it would apply to the most fundamental physical thing, say, or maybe the most fundamental metaphysical thing, whether that be the neoclassical theistic God or what have you. But we can set that thing aside, we can set this response aside, because I think there is an even more pressing and an even more powerful objection to this. And this more pressing objection is that these aren't efficient sustaining causal actualizers of the existence of the coffee. Notice that these examples of alleged efficient sustaining actualizers are actually parts of the coffee, right? Water is a constituent of the coffee. Atoms are constituents of the water. The subatomic particles are constituents of the atoms, and so on. But it's just mistaken to identify these parts of substantial wholes as sustaining efficient causal actualizers of said wholes. One reason derives from a plausible Aristotelian view of the relation between parts and substantial wholes they compose. According to this view, the identity of a substance as parts only makes sense in light of the identity of the whole substance. That is, whole substances are in some sense prior to and more fundamental than their parts. So, for instance, something's being my kidney seems to presuppose the more fundamental reality of me as a substantial unity. Parts, then, presuppose the ontologically prior existence of their substance, and thus cannot efficiently causally explain its existence, according to this Aristotelian view, that is. And so here's a second reason why these parts of a substance cannot be efficient sustaining causes of that substance. Feser himself is committed to various metaphysical theses within Aristotelianism that would undermine that. For parts of substances don't exist in actuality, and thus only exist in potency. Feser writes, for instance, that, quote, "The hydrogen and oxygen are in water only virtually, rather than actually." He says that in his book Scholastic Metaphysics on page 197. But if the parts don't exist in actuality, well, then they can't actualize the existence of the substances of which they are constituents. This follows straightforwardly from Feser's causal principle, according to which things can only be actualized by something actual, right? And so, a few notes here. First, I'm not claiming here that the Aristotelian is committed to the view that such parts cannot compose the substance in question. Instead, I'm simply arguing that the parts of the substance cannot serve as that substance's efficient sustaining cause. And moreover, technically speaking, the two particular problems that I just raised above are going to apply only if one finds certain Aristotelian or non-reductionist views of substances plausible or even rationally defensible. If one does, then one has reason to reject or doubt Feser's appeal to parts as efficient causes of their wholes. And moreover, nothing Feser says rules out such views, and they're eminently defensible and, I think, accepted by Feser himself, as I was quoting earlier. And so here are three further reasons to accept this second criticism of this response. First, we've been given no reason as to why a relation of composition is also a relation of efficient causal actualization. Indeed, we've seen reasons to reject this, and in fact, that's taken for granted in most of contemporary philosophy that a relation of constitution or composition is not an efficient causal relation. Secondly, we've been given no reason why such causes count as efficient rather than material causes. And third, because the per se chain in question involves the more fundamental members composing less fundamental members, the first member in such a series will simply be an uncomposed composer. But given Feser's conception of God, God is not a component of anything, and so it's actually deleterious or harmful to Feser's argument to adduce these parts here. Now, actually, at this very juncture, a reviewer brought up this point to me. They said Feser gives another argument for the demand for a concurrent sustaining cause of at least material substances from the interdependence of form and matter. He says, quote, "The prime matter of material substance depends for its concrete existence on the substance's substantial form, and the substantial form depends for its concrete existence on being realized in prime matter, and thus we would have an explanatory vicious circle unless there was something outside the form-matter composite that actualizes it or keeps it in being," end quote. It's on page 29. And so the way that I responded to this, to the reviewer is like, well, I already addressed this argument in my IJPR paper, so I just kind of punted to that, and so I didn't really include it in the paper, but I want to include it in this video presentation because it's at least an important objection. And so here's a very brief overview of how I would respond. So firstly, even if we granted everything here, this would only get you to the claim that a material substance at any moment at which it exists requires an outside cause. But Feser is trying to apply this to any act potency composite whatsoever. So for instance, even something that's a metaphysically necessary ground of being, although it might have accidental properties, namely the neoclassical theistic God, say, or the panentheistic God. So again, the neoclassical theist or panentheist can accept that the material substances at any moment at which they exist require sustaining causation from without and whatever. So this argument isn't actually threatening them, and it wouldn't conclude to classical theism. And so it fails to justify that premise 7 that Feser is saying, which is that any changeable substance, any act, potency, composite object requires a sustaining cause, because this only applies to material things. But that's granting that the argument succeeds, which I wouldn't grant. So here are some other responses that I give. So first, the argument gives inertialists, for instance, existential inertialists who don't already accept hylomorphism, no reason to change their position, because it just assumes hylomorphism, and Feser was expressly intending his argument to stand or fall irrespective of hylomorphism. Second, it seems plausible that vicious circularity is impossible regardless of whether the viciously intertwined things are undergirded by some outside explanation, since vicious circularity involves something being both prior and posterior to itself, which is absurd, and thus appeal to an outside cause doesn't resolve anything here. He's merely imputed to material objects an impossibility from the get-go, it seems to me. Again, I'm just doing speed round here because I just wanted to touch on this because the reviewer said it and I really wanted to address it. Third, even granting the need for an explanation outside the form and matter, an outside explanation need not be in terms of a concurrent efficient sustaining cause. It could instead consist in hold-apart grounding, or an existential inertial tendency, or a temporally prior cause or explanation rather than a sustaining cause, or metaphysical necessity, or tons of other explanations. Again, see that blog post that I pointed to earlier as a response to Show and Sanders. Fourth, the argument applies only to material things, and thus, even if successful, it doesn't rule out inertially persistent non-material things. So I just had to, scratch an itch there. So that's this third response. I've given lots of reasons to think why it doesn't succeed. So let's move on to yet another response to my fundamental criticism here of Feser's justification for premise 7. And this says that wholes are merely impotency to the parts that compose them unless and until the parts are concurrently combined, and hence whole substances, at any moment at which they exist, reduce from potency to act in respect of their existence. Now, this response, however, begs the question at issue. It's precisely the question at issue whether wholes are merely in potency unless and until their parts are concurrently held together. This amounts to merely presupposing that it is false, that wholes are actual without reducing from potency to act in respect of their existence. And so it doesn't do as a justification for premise 7, because it just assumes premise 7, or something near enough. Moreover, you can deny this by adopting whole-to-part grounding, and so a whole can in some sense explain or ground its parts, and so it's not as though it's in potency to its parts that come together and are more fundamental than the whole. It's a very popular notion in contemporary philosophy, as well as even in Aristotelianism, this notion of whole-to-part grounding. So those are some responses to that. And finally, as a fifth response, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one might say that the possibility that S's parts compose a different substance entails that S reduces from potentially existent to actually existent, but I think that that's just simply non sequitur. From the mere fact that something could be otherwise than it in fact is, or could possibly be absent from reality altogether, it doesn't follow that its current state is one involving a transition, a genuine kind of transition, or becoming, or reduction from non-existence to existence, or from potency to act, or what have you. X is possibly being otherwise, for instance, or X is possibly being absent, does not by itself entail the present reduction of X's potential to exist from potency to act. Instead, all it tells us is that 1, X is actual, and 2, X has the potential to be otherwise, or to be absent. But that conjunction is perfectly compatible with X's actuality not consisting, in a present reduction of potentially existent to actually existent. Okay, so now we're going to move on to section 4, per se chains. So in this section, I'm going to be offering at least what I take to be another undercutting defeater of the Aristotelian proof. And so to accomplish this, I'm going to first articulate a new metaphysical account of per se chains, or at least one necessary condition for such chains, of which each of the following seem true. So first, it seems prima facie plausible. I guess I skipped forward too early. First, it seems prima facie plausible. Second, it's explanatorily powerful by my lights. Third, if true, it would undermine the Aristotelian proof. And 4, neither the Aristotelian proof nor what is said in justifying its premises gives those who hold to such an account of per se chains, or are neutral on it, reason to abandon their position. And so the account runs as follows. A per se sustaining cause C is required for substance S's being in condition or outcome O, or exemplifying some property F, only if I'm going to exclude that exemplifying property F from now on for sake of simplicity, only if 1, there is some causal factor or force F, intrinsic or extrinsic to S, acting on S to bring S towards some condition or outcome not O. 2, F is a net factor or force in the absence of C's causal operation, and 3, S, or some state of affairs involving S, is in condition or outcome O distinct from not O. And so I'm going to clarify the meanings of the various terms in the quote-unquote paragraphs that follow, but that's really what I'm verbalizing right here. So technically there aren't any paragraphs on here that you're going to be able to read, but yeah. And so these are just the 4 benefits that I articulated just previously on the last slide. Okay, so a couple of notes. An intrinsic causal factor or force would be something like a natural tendency or inclination or disposition inherent to a thing. For example, something had by its very nature, whereas an extrinsic one would be something like the effect of gravity or friction or whatever. Moreover, I don't mean net force in an expressly mechanistic or physical way, although such forces would be subcategories of what I mean. Instead, I just mean a kind of causal factor or a group of causal factors whose overall causal contribution is like a vector quantity, insofar as it contributes toward a definite end state or outcome and is not counterbalanced by some other causal factor or group of causal factors. And a vector, of course, is something with direction and magnitude, so you can think of it like an arrow. Philosophers tend to like to visualize causation as a kind of vector-like quantities, because you can have various causes impinging on something in various ways, and they can kind of compound together oftentimes. So yeah. So again, I'm going to clarify the meanings of the various terms in the verbalized paragraphs that follow. For now, I'm just going to note that this account is only specifying one necessary condition for per se chains, at least a condition that is necessary by my lights and that what I'm going to argue for. It does not purport to give a full analysis of such chains in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. It also does not purport to give a full metaphysical characterization of such chains. As we will see, and as I will argue, however, the account nevertheless provides a foundation for an undercutting defeater of the Aristotelian proof. So now let's talk about satisfying these criteria, okay? So firstly, I want to begin with the account's prima facie plausibility. So let's first consider one of Feser's examples of per se causal chains. In explaining why a coffee cup is 3 feet above the floor, Feser writes that, quote, it is sitting there at that moment only because the desk is holding it up at that moment. And the desk is holding it up at that moment only because it is in turn being held up at that same moment by the floor, end quote. Page 21 of his book. Other uncontroversial examples of per se causal chains include a lamp being held aloft by chains, in turn being held aloft by the ceiling, and so on, the stone moved by the stick, moved by the hand, and so on, gear 1 being turned by gear 2 by gear 3, and so on. And so notice, though, that in each of these chains, it seems plausible that the principal reason concurrent causal sustenance is required is that absent such sustenance, there is some net force, as it were, or net causal factor that is causally contributing to a single definite outcome. In other words, the causal operation of the sustaining per se cause C seems required precisely because C acts against what would otherwise be a net causal factor towards some different outcome. And so to see why this is at least plausible, consider again Feser's example. It seems that precisely because, absent the table's existence, the cup would revert to the ground, that it requires causal sustenance to remain in the air, right? And this, in turn, is because there is a net causal factor, namely gravity, operating on the cup that the table is actively preventing from achieving its definite causal outcome. In this case, attraction toward the center of Earth's mass. And the same seems plausibly to apply to other examples of per se chains. So, for instance, the stone has net causal factors operating on it so as to keep it stationary, like friction, gravitational and normal forces, and so on. A concurrent sustaining cause of the stone's motion seems required precisely because such a cause contravenes the causal activity of the friction, gravity, and so on toward the definite outcome of stationary spatial position or location, at least relative to our frame of reference. At the very least, then, I contend that a consideration of these uncontroversial cases of per se chains gives us reason to think that it's prima facie plausible that a requirement of per se chains is that there is either 1, a causal force that inclines things toward an outcome and not O, that is contrary to the outcome O produced by the causally sustaining intervention, or 2, a natural tendency, inclination, or disposition of a thing toward not O, that is actively being suppressed by the causal sustainer in order to maintain that outcome or condition O. And so now let's consider the account's explanatory power. So consider first that the account seems to nicely capture each uncontroversial case of per se chains. For as we've seen, in uncontroversial cases of per se chains, like the cup held on the table, the chains held aloft, the handstick stone, the gears, and so on, the non-fundamental members, that is, the ones being causally sustained by the primary or fundamental member, are invariably found to be under the influence of vector-like causal factors, V, that incline them toward a definite outcome, not O. And the primary sustaining cause invariably counteracts V with a causal vector, with either equal or greater magnitude than V, that is in the opposite direction, as it were, of V. That is, toward O instead of not O. Second, the account nicely captures or nicely explains why the non-primary, less fundamental members require a sustaining cause. For it would simply be inexplicable if S retained its condition or outcome O in the presence of net causal factors V inclining S toward not O. That is to say, an outcome different from O, in the absence of some primary sustaining cause that counteracts V to keep S in O. It is precisely for this reason that causal sustenance is needed in such chains if the less fundamental members are to retain their condition, property, or outcome O. The account therefore seems to provide an illuminating explanation of this aspect of per se chains. Third, the account also explains why per se chains plausibly cannot regress infinitely, at least if we grant Feser that premise, in the sense of having infinitely many non-fundamental members without some fundamental sustaining per se cause of the series. For suppose that the account that I provided is true. Well, then, it's no surprise why infinite chains subordinated per se of non-fundamental members without a primary sustaining cause are impossible. For then there is a net causal factor or group of factors acting on the members of the chain without anything counteracting such factors. Once again, it would then be inexplicable as to how or why the infinite chain's members retain condition, property, or outcome O, when there is indeed that non-counteracted causal vector inclining the whole series toward not O. Fourth, the account can also explain the wholly derivative nature of per se chains, something that philosopher Caleb Coho identifies as integral to them. Caleb Coho, integral, I said that weird. Anyway, Caleb Coho says, quote, "An essentially ordered causal series is asymmetric, irreflexive, and wholly derivative. The subsequent members serve as causes only insofar as they have been caused by and are effects of all the preceding members. Because these intermediate causes possess causal powers only by deriving them from all the preceding causes, they need a first and non-derivative cause," end quote. For if my account is true, right, then the less fundamental members as being in condition O is due wholly to the sustaining cause that provides the counteracting vector causality. The less fundamental members wholly derive their being in condition O from the primary member which provides that counteracting causality, right? They are in O only insofar as the primary member continuously and concurrently provides the counteractive causality. And for each member M in the chain, M's being in O depends on all previous members, insofar as the non-primary members, quote-unquote, channel the vector causality to M from the primary cause C. Now, okay, I guess I should say that I'm not claiming that this is exactly how Caleb Coho would analyze the situation. As I emphasized at the beginning of this particular section of the video, I'm offering a metaphysical account, my own metaphysical account of per se chains, right? My purpose in discussing Coho here is simply to emphasize how the account I'm offering, if true, provides a neat explanation of some of the integral features of such chains that Coho identifies. So again, we're looking at all the reasons why I think this is explanatorily powerful. We looked at uncontroversial cases. It can explain those. It can explain why non-fundamental members require sustenance. It explains why they're finite. It explains the wholly derivative nature of such chains. And finally, I'm going to argue that it provides a good explanation of cases of non-sustenance when sustenance isn't required. And so fifth, that's my fifth point under the explanatory power thing. Fifth, it accounts very well for cases where plausibly no per se sustaining cause is needed. For instance, return to Feser's cup. Plausibly, absent any gravitational force pulling it down, it simply retains its spatial location without causal sustenance. Consider astronauts on the ISS or International Space Station who, upon placing a cup in location L, observe the cup remain in L, without any causal factor sustaining it there. Plausibly, the only reason the cup would fail to remain 3 feet above the ground, on Earth at least, is because there is a net causal force acting on it to pull it towards a given outcome. And the reason it is in fact able to remain 3 feet high, even in the presence of what would otherwise be a net causal factor, seems to be because some cause C is actively concurrently preventing the net factor from eliciting its characteristic outcome. C accomplishes this by providing a causal force or factor towards an outcome contrary to that dominant in C's absence. But absent a tendency or causally inclining factor toward either O or not O, it seems plausible that S, some substance S like the cup that we were talking about, will simply remain in the condition or state in which it is in, as there would be no reason or explanation as to why it deviated away from the outcome in which it actually finds itself. And this is precisely what the cup on the ISS seems to reveal. Although the cup by itself has no capacity or causal inclination to be in any particular location, it will nevertheless remain in the actual location L in which it finds itself, relative to some frame of reference, without requiring an external causal factor keeping it there. And again, this is plausibly because 1, the cup is presently in L, 2, any deviation from L would be inexplicable in the absence of a tendency or causal factor inclining the cup away from L, and 3, there is no such tendency or causally inclining factor operative. So I've spelled out the metaphysical account, or at least the necessary condition for it. I've defended its prima facie plausibility. I've given 5 reasons why I think it's quite explanatorily powerful. Now I'm going to argue that if true, it would undermine the Aristotelian proof. And I'm also going to argue that neither the Aristotelian proof nor what is said in justifying its premises give those who hold to such account or are neutral on it reason to abandon their position. For we can simply apply the account to a substance's actual existence. And once we do that, we get the following. A per se sustaining cause C is required for substance S's actual existence only if there is some F, either intrinsic or extrinsic to S, acting on S to bring S toward non-existence. Secondly, F is a net factor or force in the absence of C's existential efficient causal sustenance. And 3, S actually exists, such that actual existence is distinct from the condition or outcome of non-existence. Speaking very loosely in terms of a condition or outcome of non-existence, I kind of just mean not having the condition or outcome of existence. But here's the rub. On the basis of the Aristotelian proof, that is, its premises and what Feser says on their behalf, the first and second condition that I just specified there, this condition 1 and this condition 2, as applied to actual existence, those have simply not been adequately justified as holding. And because these are necessary conditions, per the account in question, for the requirement of a sustaining cause, it follows that, on the basis of the Aristotelian proof and what is said on its behalf, the need for a per se sustaining cause of S's actual existence, espoused in premise 7, has not been adequately justified. Now, okay, technically speaking, that only follows provided that we accept a kind of epistemic modus tollens or epistemic closure principle, according to which if we know that P entails Q, and we know that we are inadequately justified in accepting Q in the dialectical context at hand, then we know, or at least are in a position to know, that we are inadequately justified in accepting P. But I'm just going to assume this version of epistemic modus tollens for the purposes of my argument. It's a popular closure principle in philosophy. It's reasonably plausible. And okay, so to put the problem more concretely, under the account of per se chains I've provided, if substance S lacks a tendency either way, neither towards persistent existence nor existential expiration or instantaneous annihilation, then once the substance is placed in condition O, i.e. once brought into actual existence, S will simply retain O or remain in O as a form of stasis. Its continually occupying such an outcome or state will simply not involve a reduction of potency to act, but will instead be a persisting state of stasis or actuality. And this follows simply upon the account I've given, right? Any deviation from the actual state, condition, or outcome O in which S finds itself would be inexplicable in the absence of 1, a tendency toward a different outcome, like non-existence, and 2, a net causal factor inclining S toward that condition or outcome, namely non-existence. But, and here's the rub, Feser has given those who accept my account or are even neutral on it, like I myself, I'm quite neutral on this account, I just think it's reasonably plausible, Feser has given us no reason to abandon our view, a view which would, if true, undermine the Aristotelian proof. The justifications Feser proffers on behalf of premise 7 demonstrate neither A, the falsity of my account, nor B, the existence of either 1, a tendency of things to expire or annihilate, or 2, a net causal factor pulling or inclining things toward non-existence at any moment at which they exist. And as we've seen, A and B are precisely what need to be ruled out in order to affirm premise 7. And so before turning to my next criticism of the Aristotelian proof, I do want to emphasize that I'm not claiming that this account of per se chains is absolutely correct, nor am I claiming that those of Aristotelian Thomist persuasion rationally ought to accept it, or that they wouldn't disagree with it. Instead, my sole purpose has been to show 1, why someone might be attracted to such an account of per se chains, and 2, how the justification Feser's premise 7 doesn't provide someone who accepts or is neutral on my account with reason to abandon their position. That's all I'm intending to establish. You might have other reasons, for instance, depending on like the de ante argument or other sorts of things to rule that out, but if you're adducing those in this dialectical context, well then the Aristotelian proof fails as an independent proof of God's existence and is wholly parasitic on the de ante proof, which is all I've been meaning to establish, that the Aristotelian proof fails as an independent demonstration of God's existence. And so, again, my point is not to claim that those of Aristotelian Thomist persuasion rationally ought to accept this, or that it's correct, or what have you. I'm offering it as an undercutting defeater. This was the importance of the dialectical points that I made at the beginning. But there is an objection to my account that I do want to consider before turning to my next criticism of the Aristotelian proof, and the objection is essentially as follows. So the objection, and this is from a very kind reviewer from Sophia, so thanks to that anonymous reviewer. While the account is plausible for many cases of per se chains, says this reviewer, it seems to fail for other cases. Consider, for instance, the illumination of a surface, like the moon or the surface of a wall on which a flashlight is shining. Some Thomists are fond of giving this as an instance of a per se causal chain, but it doesn't seem to involve a vector at like counteracting causal factor. So take that, Joe. Okay, so I thought this was a really cool objection from the referee. So I have 3 responses to make to it. So first, it's not clear that the case of illumination is, after all, a per se causal chain. So let's just focus on the case of the moon's present illumination. Now, there are at least 2 ways we can understand quote-unquote illumination. Number 1, there's the experience of the objects being illuminated, which requires light to bounce off the object and reach our retinas. And secondly, there's the bouncing of photons/light off the object itself, regardless of whether we experience it. I'm going to use the latter understanding here. So again, let's just focus on the case of the moon's present illumination. So the causal power property of the series here is presumably something like being illuminated, right? That's what's the derivative causal feature here. So what is the per se cause of this property? Well, it can't be the sun, right? I mean, if you removed the sun, the moon would still remain illuminated for about 8 minutes or so, but the removal of a per se cause collapses instantaneously the causality of the chain, such that it necessitates the removal of the chain's causal power or property. And so the sun is not the per se cause here. Well, then what then is it, right? I mean, it won't be any of the photons in the space between the sun and the moon, since those have nothing to do with the moon's present illumination, and nor will it be any of the photons in the space between the moon and the Earth. The only candidate per se cause, then, would seem to be the collection of photons presently striking or bouncing off the moon's surface. But isn't that the very thing that quote-unquote being illuminated consists in? In other words, the quote-unquote effect in this per se chain is X being illuminated. But X being illuminated seems to be nothing other than photons striking or bouncing off X. In that case, though, the effect just is what we previously took to be the only candidate per se cause, namely the photons striking/bouncing off X, where X is the moon. But surely that's absurd, right? A cause and effect must be distinct. And supposing that this is a per se chain, then, seems to end in this kind of absurdity, and hence plausibly, so I said to this reviewer, it isn't a per se chain. And the underlying problem, it seems to me, is that we only have like a single event here, right? Like, namely photons is presently bouncing off the moon. We don't have two distinct events, or two distinct objects, as the case might be, which is dissimilar to per se chains of causation, wherein there are distinct events, or as the case may be, objects, which I just said, subordinated to one another as causes and effects, albeit not in terms of temporal priority, but instead in terms of ontological priority. So it just seems as though we have a single event here, not like two events, or things like that are subordinated to one another. We just have the photons as presently bouncing off the moon. Now, of course, there's the velocities of that beforehand and afterhand. But again, the beforehand and the afterhand, like when the photon is in the space between the sun and the moon, that I already argued that those aren't going to be the per se sustaining cause, because you can remove those while the moon retains its illumination, because the present things that are bouncing off of it, not the ones that are in between, in that space in between. So, yeah, my first response is that it's not clear to me, at least, that illumination constitutes a per se chain. But second, even if it is a per se chain, right, it's not clear that my account doesn't capture it. I mean, the vector-like causal or explanatory factors that maintain the non-illumination of the relevant surface could plausibly be 1, the nature of reflective surfaces, and 2, the absence of light in the surface's ambient environment. The former is an intrinsic explanatory factor, while the latter is an extrinsic explanatory factor. These may jointly comprise a kind of causal or explanatory vector directed towards the outcome or condition of non-illumination. A counteracting causal or explanatory vector would either alter the nature of the reflective surface by, say, giving it some light-emitting property, or the extrinsic environment by introducing light, say. Thus, if Feser wishes to locate existence within a per se chain, he must, in a principled, non-question-begging manner, point to some intrinsic or extrinsic fact about act-potency composites in virtue of which they require a counteracting vector in terms of per se causal sustenance. And this is something that, as I argued in the previous kind of slide, he hasn't done. Which isn't to say that it cannot or will not be done, of course. I offer this as a tool for fresh inquiry, not as some kind of knockdown insuperable difficulty, right? We're all just explorers on a journey to truth here. And my third response is that even if the case of illumination is a per se causal chain, and even if my count fails for it, the onus is on Feser and the proponents of the Aristotelian proof to justify why existence is more like the case of illumination than the other cases that my account does capture, for example, the cup's location and whatnot. But importantly, Feser, in his chapter on the Aristotelian proof, hasn't done this, and thus we still seem to have an undercutting defeater on our hands, even if my account fails to capture some cases of per se causal chains. So that is an undercutting defeater, yet another one that I offer towards Feser's Aristotelian proof. And now let's move on to CP and existence as stasis. So the difficulties for Feser's Aristotelian proof extend further. One difficulty in particular stems from one of Feser's accounts of the compatibility of that causal principle, CP, and mechanical inertia. So the account treats uniform spatial motion, the account that I'm talking about, namely Feser, one of Feser's accounts of the compatibility here, treats uniform spatial motion as stasis, or unchangingness, rather than involving change as the actualization of potential. Feser writes, precisely because the principle of inertia treats uniform local motion as a state, it treats it thereby as the absence of change. In this case, the question of how the principle of motion, i.e. the causal principle that we're talking about, and the principle of inertia relate to one another does not even arise." End quote. But just as we can understand uniform spatial motion as stasis or unchangingness, it seems we can equally justifiably understand persistence in existence as an absence of change. Indeed, this seems to be the ordinary common-sense way we conceive of persistence. Remaining or persisting in existence is commonly thought not to involve change, but rather the maintenance of a state of actuality. Indeed, we tend to think only that deviations from something's state of non-existence or existence count as changes, i.e. either coming into or passing out of being. Even if we deny this common-sense conception of persistence in existence as stasis, at the very least it seems we lack any principled, non-arbitrary, non-question-begging reason to think 1. Persistence in uniform spatial motion is a state, but 2. Persistence in existence at any moment cannot be. But if we lack justification for denying that persistence in existence at any moment constitutes a state of unchangingness, or the absence of change, well then we lack justification for the application of the causal principle, or CP, in the context of the Aristotelian proof, to some substance S's persistence in existence at a given moment. Right? The demand for a per se sustaining cause of S's persistent existence at any moment on the basis of the causal principle is therefore unjustified. We've simply been given no reason to suppose that S's existence at a moment involves a process of actualization instead of, or as opposed to, a state of actuality. So that's another undercutting defeater for the Aristotelian proof. So now let's turn to a tension between the Aristotelian proof and classical theism as such, which I think constitutes perhaps a rebutting defeater to the argument, since, if successful, well then it would show that the Aristotelian proof is itself not compatible with the very thing it is supposed to establish. Right, so recall again premise 7. The existence of S at any given moment itself presupposes the concurrent actualization of S's potential for existence. Now, here Feser is explicit that any changeable substance, S, is such that its potential for existence is actualized at any moment at which S exists. In other words, changeable substances at any moment at which they exist reduce from potency to act, or transition from potency to act in respect of their existence. Indeed, the causal principle, or CP, that Feser employs, captured in premises 4 and 5, requires that each changeable substance reduces from potency to act in respect of its very being or existence. For again, the CP only allows us to infer a causal actualizer when there is a reduction from potency to act. It's completely silent about cases when there is not such a reduction from potency to act. This is because CP only states that whatever reduces from potency to act is actualized by something in a state of actuality. But under classical theism, creation cannot be the causing of something to reduce from potency to act. Creation is simply not the transition of substances from potency to act. Ontologically prior to God's creative act, the only thing in existence under classical theism is God, and moreover God is purely actual. And so no potencies, strictly speaking, exist prior to creation. If no potencies exist, strictly speaking, prior to creation, well then they only exist posterior to creation. But then each changeable substance's actuality isn't ontologically preceded by potency. And if each changeable substance's actuality isn't so preceded, well then it's simply false to say that each changeable substance's actual existence consists in or results from a reduction of or transition from potency to act, a kind of actualization of potential. S's reducing from potency to act presupposes some potency requiring actualization by some causal actualizer. In short, creation under classical theism is not a change. Creation is not some kind of actualization of a potential. It's the very production in being of all the actualities and potentialities of a substance in question. Now, Feser may respond to this objection by distinguishing between passive and active potency, arguing that although passive potency doesn't pre-exist creation, so passive potency is just the ability to be causally affected, whereas active potency is like an active causal power or capacity, that would pre-exist creation, whereas passive potency doesn't. But first, active potencies are not potentialities, but are actually instead a kind of actuality, and so this doesn't actually help the case, as Feser points out in his page 43 of his book Scholastic Metaphysics. Second, Feser simply cannot be referring to God's active potency in premise 7. This is because the potency referenced in premise 7 is one that is actualized, that is to say, one that is caused. It is reduced or causally reduced from potency to act, but nothing in God is caused or actualized or reduced from potency to act. Now, before moving on, I wish to emphasize that I do not claim that this is a problem for classical theism as such. Instead, my aim is simply here to pinpoint a fundamental tension that I take to exist between classical theism and the Aristotelian proof's explicit treatment of creation as the actualization of a potential. So this is another rebutting defeater by my lights of the argument. And so now let's turn to Feser's inference to the presently unactualized actualizers being purely actual. So suppose we grant Feser that there are at least some concrete objects that reduce from potentially existent to actually existent at each non-first moment m of their existence. On the basis of CP, Feser holds that such concrete objects require efficient causal sustenance for their actual existence at m. and any such chain, Feser argues, must have a first member. According to Feser, however, we can infer not only that such chains have a first member, but also that the first member is purely actual or unchangeable. I will argue, however, that this inference is a non sequitur on multiple fronts. So to show this, it's first necessary to quote Feser at length with respect to his justification for it. So Feser writes, "What it means for such a series to have a first member is that there is something which can impart causal power to the other members of the series without having to have, that's my emphasis, that power imparted to it, something that has its causal power in a built-in or non-derivative way. Now, since what is being explained in this case is the actualization of a thing's potential for existence, the sort of first cause we were talking about is one which can actualize the potential for other things to exist without having to have its own existence actualized by anything." I'm trying to stress something, as we will see. What this entails is that the cause doesn't have any potential for existence that needs to be actualized. Sorry, I'm emphasizing this because this will become important later on. What this entails is that this cause doesn't have any potential for existence that needs to be actualized in the first place. It just is actual, always and already actual, as it were. Indeed, you might say that it doesn't merely have actuality the way the thing it actualizes do, the things it actualizes do, but that it just is pure actuality itself. He says that on page 27. But notice that all we're entitled to conclude about the terminating actualizer A in a chain of per se actualization of substance S's existence at time M or moment M is that 1. At M, A is actual, 2. At M, A is not reducing from potentially existent to actually existent, and 3. At M, A does not have to have its own existence actualized by anything. Indeed, Feser recognizes that this is all that we are entitled to conclude about A, as Feser is careful to articulate the phrase repeatedly, having to have. It doesn't have to have its own existence actualized by anything. Having to have. Its existence doesn't need to be actualized in the first place. It doesn't have a potential that needs to be actualized. Importantly, though, I think I need to go on to the next slide. No, that's not yet. Okay, importantly though, 1, 2, and 3 here, right? These are perfectly compatible with the possibility at M of A's having its own existence actualized by something else. All Feser has shown is that it is not necessarily the case that, at M, A derives its existence from another. But that is perfectly compatible with the conjunction of A not in fact deriving existence from another, and it's being possible for A to derive existence from another. In such a case, however, A would still have a potential pertaining to its existence, namely a potential, which is not actual, for its existence to be, or have been, rather, actualized, that is not right now reducing from potency to act or being actualized by another. So, because this point is central to the Aristotelian proof, it's worth dwelling on it further. All we're entitled to infer thus far is that 1, if there is a substance that is right now reducing from potentially existent to actually existent, then it requires a concurrent cause. And 2, if this concurrent cause is itself right now reducing from potentially existent to actually existent, then it requires a concurrent cause. And that 3, since this constitutes a per se chain, the series cannot be infinite, and hence terminates in a first member, A. For all Feser has shown, however, A is unlike the other members of the series only insofar as A is not right now reducing from potentially existent to actually existent. But this neither means nor entails that A cannot possibly reduce from potentially existent to actually existent right now. All it entails is that A is not in fact presently reducing from potentially existent to actually existent. And we therefore cannot, on the basis of Feser's Aristotelian proof, that is, infer A's being purely actual with respect to A's present existence. Since all we're entitled to conclude is that A is presently actual with respect to its existence and not presently reducing from potentially existent to actually existent. If we want to establish that A is purely actual with respect to its present existence, we would not only have to show that A's present existence is actual without reducing from potency to act, but we would also have to establish that A's present existence is such that it cannot possibly be presently reducing from potency to act. And Feser has simply not established this. But suppose, contrary to what I've argued, that Feser could establish that A is purely actual with respect to its present existence. Even so, it still wouldn't follow that A is purely actual with respect to its existence simpliciter. This is because we are considering a chain of per se causes solely in the present moment. The causal role A plays concerning the present moment indexed causal chain to which A stands as terminus is only a present causal role. Nothing seems to be entailed about A's existence in the past or the future. The causal role of A, qua indexed solely to the present moment, only seems to facilitate inferences about A's actuality with respect to the present. I realize that I said qua there. That just means as. I love that word, qua. Croissant. Okay, let me retrace my steps because now we've gotten off track. So nothing, it seems. So I've said the causal role that A plays concerning the present moment index causal chain to which A stands as terminus is only a present causal role. Nothing, it seems, is automatically entailed about A's existence in the past or the future. The causal role of A, qua indexed solely to the present moment, seems only to facilitate inferences about A's actuality with respect to the present. The present existence of the chain is, for all Feser has shown, the only explanatory lacuna A needs to fill. The effect is, according to the argument, wholly present, and hence the only truths about A we seem able to infer are ones concerning its present existence and causal role. Now, one might object, but can't we run the exact same argument for other moments, and hence conclude to an unsustained being at those moments? Well, yes, you can, but nothing Feser says justifies the claim that the exact same A, which serves as the terminus for the chain or chains at moment M, is also the one that serves as the terminus at moments distinct from M. So we therefore seem entitled to infer only that A is purely actual with respect to its present existence. Nothing follows about A's being purely actual with respect to its existence simpliciter. So even granting Feser that A is purely actual with respect to its present existence, it does not follow that A is purely actual with respect to its existence simpliciter. I realized just a moment ago I said, yes, nothing Feser. So remember, we were just considering an objection which says, well, can't we run the exact same argument for other moments? I said, yes, but nothing Feser says justifies the claim that the exact same A, which serves as the terminus for the chain at moment M, is also the one that serves as terminus for moments distinct from M. You might say, oh, well, Feser proves that this being is unique. Haha. Well, no, his proof of uniqueness, which I don't think succeeds in its own right. See my first way video on that. But more importantly, that proof relies on the inference to pure actuality. But we haven't even gotten to the inference to pure actuality yet, right? Right now, that's the very question at issue. We're just focusing on the inference from A's being presently purely actual to A's with respect to its present existence to A's being purely actual with respect to its existence simpliciter. We haven't even gotten to pure actuality as such, and moreover, because that's the very question at issue in this dialectical context, namely this present inference that we're looking at from unactualized to purely actual actualizer, that would just be question begging to appeal to that at this point in the dialectical context, because that's a very question at issue. Okay, sorry, had to rant there because some of you might be thinking that, but so the second we identified the first non sequitur. It doesn't follow from A's being presently unactualized actualizer that A is purely actual with respect to its present existence. But even if it did follow, it doesn't follow from A's being purely actual with respect to its present existence that A is purely actual with respect to its existence simpliciter. And now we're going to move on to a third non sequitur. So even if Feser could establish that A is purely actual with respect to its existence simpliciter, it doesn't follow that A is purely actual simpliciter. This is because there are potencies that don't relate to the very existence of the substance, the very substantial existence of the substance to which they belong. All we can infer from A's existence being purely actual is that A has no potential to begin to exist, cease to exist, or fail to exist. In other words, A is a necessarily existent being. But necessary beings need not be unchangeable, since there are changes that are unrelated to the very existence of the substantial whole, namely accidental as opposed to substantial changes. Consider, for instance, the God of neoclassical theism. Under neoclassical theism, God is a metaphysically necessary, perfect personal being who freely creates and sustains everything apart from himself. Nevertheless, God is temporal, that is, exists with succession in his life, and is changeable. He can gain and lose various non-essential or accidental features, like, say, relationships with creatures. So, while the neoclassical theistic God is, or would be, a metaphysically necessary being, he can nevertheless change in respects wholly unrelated to his very existence, that is, unrelated to the beginning and or cessation of his substantial existence. I've argued, then, that there are at least three non sequiturs at play here. First, it doesn't follow from A's being a presently unactualized actualizer that A is purely actual with respect to A's present existence. Second, it doesn't follow from A's being purely actual with respect to A's present existence that A is purely actual with respect to existence simpliciter. Third, it doesn't follow from A's being purely actual with respect to its existence simpliciter that A is purely actual simpliciter. Putting these together, A's being a presently unactualized actualizer, which is all Feser has established, does not entail that A utterly lacks all potentialities whatsoever, since any being which is a presently unactualized actualizer may, for all Feser has shown, have potentials which simply are not right now being actualized or are not required to be actualized for A to serve as the terminus for the given per se chain of causes or changes. Okay, it's objection time. Okay, so it's objection time. So here is one objection that someone might level. So you might object, well, the primary cause in the chain is primary only with respect to the causality of the chain in question, in which case it cannot exhibit any potency with respect to that causality. Now, I think I have 3 responses or so. So recall from the previous section that I've argued that Feser's points only justify an inference to something that is unactualized in respect to the causal feature in question. Among other reasons, this is because the causal chain would still be finite if the first member is merely unactualized in the given respect. And moreover, Feser's CP would only demand a further actualizer of this first member if it is in fact reducing from potency to act, something that I've argued Feser is not adequately justified. And while Feser may be committed to a view on which the first member is not merely unactualized, but also unactualizable in respect of the causal property of the series, the more fundamental question is whether he has demonstrated or justified this commitment to those who don't already share it. So here's an illustration of how something can plausibly exhibit potency with respect to the causal property of the series in question, while nevertheless being unactualized, in the sense of not efficiently causally actualized in said respect. So consider Feser's example where the causal property in question is something like being held up. Now, that's a rough approximation, of course, but it suffices for here. So the cup is held aloft by the table, in turn by the floor, in turn by the building's structure, in turn by the foundation, and finally by the Earth itself, Mother Earth, our true mother. So the Earth is not held up by something else, barring gravitational influence from the sun, of course, but that's not relevant to the point I wish to make here. Sorry, I have to answer my inner critic at every single point, because I know someone's going to be commenting, oh, at minute 1 hour and 40, okay. So the Earth is the first member in this series. It is unactualized in respect of being held aloft, but holds all other members aloft. But plausibly, the Earth still has potency with respect to this causal property. In other words, the Earth isn't unactualizable in respect to this causal property. For we could, theoretically at least, place a large enough mass in close proximity to the Earth, say a giant planet immediately below or above or next to, depending on how you look at it, Antarctica, or a giant enough mass like your mother. I'm kidding. Okay, so in this case, the Earth would be held aloft, right? In which case, the Earth has some potential in respect to the causality of the series, despite being first in the series in the actual world, wherein there is no such planet or no such mother holding the Earth aloft. It seems then that the first member could have some potency in respect to the causal property of the series. In other words, it seems at least possible that a first member could be unactualized, but yet not unactualizable. But the more fundamental point that I want to convey here, though, is that Feser has not provided those who accept that aforementioned point sufficient reason to abandon their position. So, moreover, even supposing that Feser could establish or has established that the first member is not only unactualized but also unactualizable, this won't arrive at a purely actual being. For the relevant quote-unquote causality of the series with which Feser is concerned is that of the very existence of the substance as a whole. But then it seems that we can only infer the existence of something that is unactualized and unactualizable in respect of the very existence of the entity as a whole. But, as I hope to illustrate in the next section, something that is not purely actual is able to satisfy this criterion. For example, the metaphysically necessary God of neoclassical theism is something that is not only unactualized, but also unactualizable in respect of the very existence or the very existence of the whole substantial entity, right? Nothing can cause such a God as a whole substance to exist or cease to exist. But nevertheless, such a necessary being may have, for all Feser has shown, that is, accidental features. And so that bridges nicely into the next section. Section 8, Changeable Necessary Beings. Changes! Alright, so the point about neoclassical theism points to a further difficulty afflicting Feser's argument. In particular, Feser's argument seems to presuppose the metaphysical impossibility of changeable necessary beings. For suppose that necessarily actually existent beings, okay? So for suppose changeable necessary beings are possible, well then it's false that any act potency composite being reduces from potentially existent to actually existent at any moment at which it exists, contra Feser's premise. This is because 1, changeable necessary beings are act potency composite objects, but 2, changeable necessary beings cannot reduce from potentially existent to actually existent. For what it means to be a necessary being is to be a being that is necessarily actually existent, as I use the phrase. And what is necessarily actually existent cannot reduce from potentially existent to actually existent, precisely because it is metaphysically impossible for any such being to be potentially existent in the first place. There is no actualization of its potential for existence precisely because, being necessarily actual, it couldn't potentially exist in the first place. It always, already, and automatically and necessarily is actual, as I use the phrase. So note that this is not to say that there cannot be a dependent necessarily actual being. It's only to say that a necessarily actual being's dependence cannot consist in or involve some kind of potency, that is to say non-actuality, of such a being's existence. But such a potency is precisely what Feser's Aristotelian proof requires. And so my point stands, And so the success of Feser's argument, therefore, presupposes the impossibility of changeable necessary beings. But no justification has been given for such a presupposition, and because it rests on an inadequately justified assumption, it follows that Feser's Aristotelian argument, or Aristotelian proof, faces another undercutting defeater. At the very least, Feser has not given those who accept, or are even neutral on, the possibility of changeable necessary beings to abandon their view. Indeed, if it seems plausible to someone that there genuinely could be changeable necessary beings, as it seems to my mind, then one has positive reason, that is, a prima facie rebutting defeater against Feser's Aristotelian proof. Now, Feser correctly anticipates some of the non sequitur worries I've been spelling out, and he attempts to circumvent them. His consideration of the non sequitur objection or objections, and his response are worth quoting at length. So Feser writes, "For why not suppose instead that it, that is to say the unactualized actualizer, has potentialities which are simply not in fact being actualized, at least not insofar as it is functioning as the first actualizer in some hierarchical series of causes. Perhaps those potentialities are actualized at some other time, when it is not so functioning, or perhaps they never are. To see what is wrong with this objection, recall once again that the regress of actualizers that we are ultimately concerned with is a regress of actualizers of the existence of things." I can't believe I left my cursor there. Gosh. The first actualizer in the series is first, then, in the sense that it can actualize the existence of other things without its own existence having to be actualized. So, suppose this first actualizer had some potentiality that had to be actualized in order for it to exist. What actualizes that potential? Should we suppose that it is something other than the first actualizer that actualizes it? But in that case, the so-called first actualizer isn't really the first actualizer, after all. It says that on page 66. Now, Feser's response here, however, is just misguided, right? The objection at hand is not that the first actualizer A possesses some potentiality that has to be actualized in order for the thing to exist. The objection is threefold. First, even if A is present, remember A, that's the unactualized actualizer, even if A is presently unactualized in respect of its existence, it doesn't follow that A is purely actual with respect to its present existence. Second, even if it did follow, it wouldn't follow that A is purely actual with respect to existence simpliciter. And third, even if that followed, it wouldn't follow that A is purely actual simpliciter. Nothing in Feser's response addresses any of these criticisms. Instead, Feser aims his reductio at the thesis that that being the actualizer A, has some potency that, quote-unquote, has to be actualized as a necessary condition for A to exist. Well, sure, Feser is right that given the causal principle, this claim entails that A cannot be the first unactualized member of the chain. But that's not the criticism. The criticism is not that A has potencies for existence whose actualization are necessary conditions for its actual existence. It is instead that, for all Feser has shown, although A is not in fact presently reducing from potentially existent to actually existent, it could nevertheless be possible that A so reduces. Or more precisely, that's one prong of the three-pronged criticism of Feser's inference, the three-pronged criticism being those three non sequiturs. Additionally, there may, for all Feser has shown, be potencies in A wholly unrelated to its presently actual existence, and this is something that Feser's reductio simply ignores. Feser has, in essence, performed a reductio on a claim that's wholly irrelevant to the criticism at hand. Right? I mean, like, look at what he's criticizing. He's saying, suppose this first actualizer had some potentiality that had to be actualized in order for it to exist. No one is saying that. That's not what this objection up here is saying. It's talking about whether or not it has potentialities which are simply not in fact being actualized. That's not saying that it has potentialities that need to be actualized in order for the thing to exist. So that first response to the non sequitur worries didn't work, but Feser does give a second response elsewhere in his book, and his second response to that allegation to his inference being a non sequitur to pure actuality, it runs as follows. So the principle agere sequitur esse, that's how I'm going to pronounce it, deal with it. I don't know if I pronounce it correct, but, deal with it. The principle agere sequitur esse basically says that these attributes and activities cannot go beyond that nature. So something's attributes and activities cannot go beyond that nature, any more than an effect can go beyond its efficient cause. Hence, a stone cannot exhibit attributes and activities like nutrition, growth, and reproduction, because those go beyond the nature of a stone. Now, he argues for this on the basis of the PSR. If an effect could go beyond its total efficient cause, well then, the part of the effect that went beyond it would have no explanation and be unintelligible. Similarly, if a thing's activities could go beyond its nature, if, for example, a stone could take in nutrients or use language, then this activity would lack an explanation and be unintelligible. Well, here is how Feser applies agere sequitur esse to infer that the unactualized actualizer A cannot have potentiality. Might not we thus say that while it, that is to say A, had no potentialities with respect to its existence, it does have potentialities with respect to its activity? There are several problems with this suggestion, however, one of which might be obvious now that we have set out the principle agere sequitur esse, according to which what a thing does reflects what it is. If the first cause of things exists in a purely actual way, how could it act in a less than purely actual way? How could its acting involve potentiality any more than its existence does? A thing's existence is, after all, what is metaphysically most fundamental about it. Everything else follows from that. So, from where in its nature are the metaphysically less fundamental potentialities for activity that the critic suggests it has supposed to derive? So, there are at least 9 reasons why this appeal to agere sequitur esse doesn't work. So let's get into those. So first, as we've seen, Feser has not even established that A is purely actual with respect to its existence. All he has established that A is presently unactualized in respect of its existence, and hence we cannot infer that A acts in a purely actual way, since it's not even established that A exists in a purely actual way. Secondly, the argument is incapable of establishing that A is purely actual, even assuming 1, that A is purely actual with respect to its existence, and 2, A's being purely actual with respect to its existence entails that A acts in a purely actual manner. Why is that? Well, because there are potencies that are unrelated both to the existence and actions of the substance to which they belong. In other words, even if Feser could establish 1 and 2, he still has not established that A is purely actual simpliciter. Consider, for instance, potencies to be affected in such and such ways, unrelated to substantial change or A's actions. Feser may retort that this would comprise A's role as the terminus of the per se chain of actualizations of potentials for existence, but this is simply not so. Ex hypothesi, A is being or could be affected in manners that are wholly unrelated to its existence and its role as existential actualizer, and so it could still be unactualized in respect of its existence. Feser's argument here is therefore inept to establish A's pure actuality simpliciter. Crap, Sorry for clicking on that. So third, as Feser himself points out, a thing can, in a sense, go beyond its nature if something makes it do so. For example, the bits of wood that make up a puppet can move when the puppeteer makes them do so, even though they cannot move on their own right. So, assuming arguendo that A exists in a purely actual way, A could easily behave in ways that involve actualizations of potential, so long as something makes A do so. Importantly, such behaviors need not relate to the very existence of A, and hence there being potentials in A relating to such behaviors is perfectly compatible with A's being purely actual with respect to its existence. Now, Feser might respond that this is impossible because being caused to behave is the actualization of a potential, and A is purely actual. But that, of course, is obviously question-begging, since whether A is purely actual full stop is precisely the question at issue. That's precisely the objection that Feser is trying to address. So, man, I keep on clicking to the next page. Fourth, Feser equivocates on the principle agere sequitur esse. He first explicates it as something like it is impossible for S, of itself, to perform action A if A is beyond or at variance with S's nature. But he then switches this understanding to something like how a thing acts reflects what it is. But what does reflect mean, and why should we accept this second understanding? The second understanding by no means follows from the first. The second reading, avoiding the vagueness of quote-unquote reflects, seems to be more precisely formulated as follows. If S exists F-wise, then S acts F-wise. Now this, or something very much like it, is what Feser needs if he wants to infer from the fact that A exists in a purely actual way, that A acts in a purely actual way. But the first understanding neither means nor entails this second understanding, and the considerations adduced in favor of the first understanding, namely the PSR, do not support the second. From the fact that nothing can act so as to contravene its nature, it simply doesn't follow that if S exists F-wise, then S acts F-wise. So that's the fourth response to this. The fifth problem is that notice that the principle under the first understanding only states that a thing cannot do what its essence or nature precludes it from doing. Even granting Feser that A is purely actual in respect of its existence, we don't thereby know anything about its essence that precludes it from having existence unrelated potentials. And again, an existence-unrelated potential is just a potential that is not a potential for the substance to exist, begin to exist, or cease to exist, or fail to exist. For example, potential for a dog to bark is unrelated to the very existence of the dog, whereas the potential for the dog to die does so relate. Indeed, we have already seen how this could work with changeable necessary beings. Such beings exist in a purely actual way, but they clearly can still have existence-unrelated potencies, such as accidental features as well as potencies for action. Sixth, there are clear counterexamples to the second understanding of the principle, the one that seems required for Feser's argument. Suppose it is true that if S exists Fys, then S acts Fys. Well, God exists in a necessary way, and so God must act in a necessary way. But then he's unable to perform contingent actions, such as freely creating and sustaining the universe, and moreover, since nothing exists in a way that is under its own control, for it would already have to exist in order to exert such control, the principle in question would entail, absurdly, that nothing acts in a way that is under its own control. Now we can go on to the seventh problem with Feser's rejoinder. And the seventh problem is that an absurd form of occasionalism seems to follow from the principle that if S exists Fys, then S acts Fys. According to Feser, any non-God S has no ability of itself to exist. The manner of S's existence is hence wholly derivative from an extrinsic cause. S is a mere instrument in respect of its existence. But if S exists merely instrumentally, then according to the principle, S can only act instrumentally. Just as S's existence is wholly instrumental to God's causal bestowal of existence, S can only act in a wholly instrumental manner. God would be the only thing that truly acts, for nothing else truly acts of itself, but rather purely derives its quote-unquote actions in a wholly instrumental manner. But this seems to be an absurd form of occasionalism. It is simply false that the only causes in the created order are mere instrumental causes of the creator. Things have real, genuine causal power of themselves. Now, once again, I should remind you guys that I'm not saying that this is entailed by classical theism. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if we accept Feser's principle that he needs for this rejoinder to work, namely that the principle that if S exists Fys, then S acts Fys, okay? So that's the seventh problem. Here's the eighth problem. One of Feser's explications of the principle is that what a thing does reflects what it is. I use this because it's just easier with the dashes. But in order to infer from such a principle anything about what A does, we would therefore need to know what A is. But even if Feser has shown that A exists in a purely actual manner, by itself that says little to nothing about what A is. It only tells us something about the manner of A's existence, but nothing about the full breadth and depth of what A is. And of course we cannot in a non-question begging manner assume that facts concerning A's existence exhaust facts concerning A, since that's precisely the question at issue, namely whether there are or can be potential features of A despite A's being purely actual with respect to its existence. Indeed, Feser seems subtly to beg the question here. One can only apply agere sequitur esse to A once one has established what A is. But what A is the very question at issue, and hence one cannot assume that what A is purely actual in order to infer that what A does or how A acts is purely actual. So that's the eighth problem. The ninth problem is that Feser's point concerning the fundamentality of existence just seems wrong-headed. Feser points out that existence is the most fundamental fact concerning a thing. But in order to validly infer from the conjunctive proposition existence is most fundamental to a thing and A is purely actual with respect to its existence, that any less fundamental aspects of A, like A's actions, must therefore be purely actual, Feser requires something like the following principle. If, on one metaphysical level, X lacks F, then X also lacks F at less fundamental metaphysical levels. But not only does Feser give no justification for such a principle, but it also seems straightforwardly false. I mean, presumably, physical facts about humans are more fundamental than psychological, or at least biological facts about humans. But the physical facts by themselves lack features such as language comprehension and imagination, whereas such features are present in human psychological facts. So for these 9 reasons, Feser's second response does not succeed. So again, like I said, this is based on my forthcoming paper, Stage 1 of the Aristotelian Proof, a critical appraisal in the journal Sophia. That'll be up on my Phil Papers site sometime. In this video, I've argued that Stage 1 of the Aristotelian Proof faces many, many, many problems. I haven't even targeted Stage 2 in this video, and I think that might even have even more problems than Stage 1. Now, so maybe I'll dedicate an entire other video to Stage 2 of the Aristotelian Proof. And note also, again, that all or nearly all of my criticisms were wholly independent of existential inertia. And so existential inertia then provides yet another defeater for the proof on top of all the ones that I've covered in this video, if indeed existential inertia is rationally defensible, or if it's true, or indeed if Feser simply hasn't given those who accept it, or are even neutral on it, sufficient reason to change their position or to change their mind. And I've argued that on many, many different occasions. Again, check the links in the description with respect to all of these. I'll have the numbers 1 through 10 in the description. You can check them out if you are so inclined. So, I mean, all in all, I've argued that premise 7 of Feser's argument succumbs to a variety of undercutting and rebutting defeaters. I've also argued that Feser's inference to A's being purely actual was riddled with at least 3 non sequiturs. I also developed an account of the metaphysics of per se chains, pinpointed some of its explanatory and theoretical virtues, and argued that it provides an undercutting defeater for Feser's Aristotelian proof. I also argued that the Aristotelian proof is in an actual tension with classical theism, the very thing it takes itself to establish, and lots and lots and lots of other problems. So that is the conclusion of my presentation of the Aristotelian proof stage 1, but not the conclusion of the video, because I want to make you guys aware of something that is epic and super dope and lit and all those other cool phrases that the kids are using these days. So what is that epic thing? Well, it is an announcement. It is an announcement. Well, I've already kind of announced it on my blog, but a lot of you guys aren't regular blog readers, and that's perfectly fine. So I'm announcing it here in my video that I've actually recently completed a research monograph, and it is entitled Change, Existential Inertia, and Classical Theistic Proofs. Here's the table of contents. It is essentially systematically tackling a variety of not tackling in the sense of like polemically, but more so exploring a variety of classical theistic proofs, a variety of new developments in reason-based action and reason-based explanation, as well as developments in abstracta, and drawing even on the book 24 or so arguments for God's existence, and bringing in some of those arguments from abstracta and using them actually to pinpoint flaws in classical theism. So a variety of looking at a bunch of different novel argumentative paths in criticizing the model of God known as classical theism, as well as looking at different proofs for classical theism, developing different arguments and looking at those. And you can see here the table of contents. It's just very exciting stuff. I'm currently contacting editors at different academic presses and whatnot, pulling all those strings. Don't get too excited, because as I say on here somewhere, the process takes many, many, many months. So you won't hear back about this for a long time. And especially like articles, those can take up to like 9 months to get your review thing back and whatnot. This is an entire book, so you can expect even longer than that. So I'm just announcing it because it's fun news. And so you can check the link in the description. I have a blog post where at the end of that blog post, I give a kind of paragraph dedicated to each chapter that I'm just explaining the contents of the chapter. So you can definitely check that out. It's very exciting. Patrons already have access to chapters 1 and 10, and on my blog I've actually given some access to, I think, the Neoplatonic proof chapter as well. And I also might have given access to chapter 2. Anyway, very exciting stuff. So yeah, if you want exclusive access and updates to this, you can become a patron. Any level of support will help. It's all in the service of the majesty of reason, of course. And of course, you get lots of other patron benefits. And yeah, so check the link in the description, and you got lots of goodies down there. And then finally, like, subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications. That's actually becoming more important than the subscribe button these days. It's crazy. But yeah, turn on that little bell for notifications. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Yeah, you can help me pay my rent. I'm a lowly college student, so I can use as much help as possible. And thank you for that. Especially thank you to my current patrons. And most importantly, share this with your friends on social media or other sorts of things. Spread the good news of the majesty of reason. And the fundamental point of most of my videos is to help you guys pursue truth, to help you guys probe the fundamental nature of reality. Whether or not you agree or disagree with the conclusions and the reasons and whatnot that I present, I hope that they sharpen your thinking, that they make you a better thinker, a better human, a more intellectually virtuous human, perhaps a more morally virtuous human, that we can love others, strive, and pursue the truth to the best of our abilities. I'm Joe Schmid. This is the Majesty of Reason, and peace out.